Proverbs 22:20 once read, "I have written for you 3 days ago sayings of counsel and knowledge." The phrase 3 days ago didn't make much sense in the context, and it was argued to be a copyist error, though there was no agreement as to the original contents. Finally, in 1924, Johann Ehrman, a German Egyptologist, solved the puzzle. The trouble was with the Hebrew word shelsham. He argued that originally the text must have read sheloshim, changing the phrase 3 days ago to the word 30. This revelation transformed the sentence into, "I have written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge." How did Ehrman come to such a conclusion? Because he had identified the original source for this section of Proverbs, which contains the sentence, "Look to these 30 chapters, they inform and educate." They originated from the instruction of Amenemophis, and sayings from this Egyptian work had found their way into the book of Proverbs, and thus the Hebrew Bible. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, we covered the first 2 sections of the book of Proverbs, which begins with chapter 1 and concludes with chapter 22, verse 16. And that's where we're picking up today, at chapter 22, verse 17. Some Bibles include a title for this 3rd section, calling it the Sayings of the Wise or the Words of the Wise, which can be a bit confusing as this is the same title used for section 4. This section, borrowed from the Egyptian instruction of Amenemophis, covers chapter 22, verse 17 to chapter 24, verse 22. Some Bibles, such as the Catholic New American Bible, also correct the strange phrase at the end of 22:19 to reflect the new revelation of Egyptian provenance. Instead of reading, "I make them known to you today, yes to you," the text now reads, "I make known to you the words of Amenemophis." This Egyptian text is closely related in content to the instruction of Ptahhotep and the instruction of Ani. These 3 pieces of Egyptian wisdom literature span over 1,300 years, and the latest, Amenemophis, predates Proverbs by several centuries, as it was composed around 1000 BCE. The first half of this section of Proverbs focuses on younger people beginning a career, while the latter half contrasts the fate of the good and the wicked. We see the familiar admonition against mistreating the poor, followed by a warning against associating with friends who have hot tempers. After that, the tone shifts to financial topics, such as pledging to cover another's debt and the danger of losing all that you own if they refuse to pay, or the promise that the expert craftsman will stand before kings. Speaking of kings, there's advice for dining with rulers. Be wary when attempting to advance your career by associating with those above you, as reaching too high can be detrimental. Avoid greed, as the pursuit of wealth will wear you out. Don't force your company on an unwilling host because you'll push them away. And don't waste your time speaking wisdom to fools. In chapter 23, verse 10, we find a repeat of Proverbs 22:28, which prohibits the removal of ancient landmarks which were erected by the ancestors. These are the hilltop shrines and worship sites inside of sacred groves dedicated to various gods and important ancestral figures. Verses 13 to 14 encourage the discipline of your children with a rod, warning that this is how you keep them from descending into Sheol. We then move to advice concerning one's friends, warning to avoid gluttons and drunkards. Chapter 23, verses 29 to 35, is a poem which offers a description of the evil effects of drunkenness. It describes screaming and shouting, blurred vision, and incoherent ramblings. The wine goes down smooth, and the deep red color is tempting, but it offers physical and psychological troubles. Don't envy the wicked in the opening of chapter 24, revealing that sometimes their lot in life is better than that of the just, despite the general message of wisdom theology. Their hearts plot violence and their words are wicked. Wars are won by strategy, not might. The wicked fall and never rise, but the just fall 7 times and rise again. This proverb about rising after you fall appears everywhere from the Mediterranean to Japan. Fall 7 times, but stand up 8. Even Michael Jordan has his version when he says that he has failed more times than most people have tried. The 4th section of Proverbs, also entitled Sayings of the Wise, though some Bibles list it as Further Sayings of the Wise, occupies the final verses of chapter 24, from verse 23 to 34. However, if you're reading from the Greek Septuagint, then you'll find this section located after chapter 30, verse 14. This section begins with the topic of justice, warning against showing partiality in judgment. Those who judge dishonestly are scorned by the people, but those who render just verdicts find blessings. Verse 26 shifts gears to give advice to the working classes, urging them to complete their tasks in the field and warning against laziness by giving an example of a field overgrown with weeds and a repeat of Proverbs 6:10 through 11. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest. Then poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like a bandit. The 5th section is entitled Second Solomonic Collection, collected under King Hezekiah. So it attributes the sayings to King Solomon, but considered them to have been collected during the time of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah instituted religious reforms following the destruction of the northern kingdom at the hands of the Assyrians. This collection may have once been attributed to Solomon and was later added during the time of Hezekiah, around 700 BCE, or it may have been an original collection under Hezekiah and was then attributed to Solomon as his legend grew. This collection covers all of chapters 25 to 29, making it the 3rd largest section in Proverbs, behind those covered in the previous episode. This section begins with the assertion of divine rule over the nations. It is the glory of kings to uncover and understand that which God conceals. Their hearts are as unfathomable as the height of the heavens, and it's his place to dispense justice to ensure the prosperity of the nation. Because of his lofty status, it's best to be humble and wait for the king to summon you than to pretend at your own worthiness and be rejected. What follows is a series of verses that make their points through imagery concerning the benefits of appropriate behavior and words, such as, golden apples in silver settings are words spoken at the proper time. By patience is a ruler persuaded, but a soft tongue can break a bone. After this, we find several verses which recommend moderation, such as verse 16. If you find honey, eat only what you need, lest you have your fill and vomit. I should probably read that proverb a few more times, especially in light of my fig addiction. Verses 21 to 22 deals with the compassionate treatment of enemies. If your enemies are hungry, give them food to eat. If thirsty, give them something to drink. Chapter 26 focuses on 3 types of evil. The first is covered in verses 1 through 12 and outlines the behavior of fools. This is what the authors of Proverbs refer to as folly in prior chapters. We learn that fools have no honor and must be guided with a rod as they're too stubborn to obey words alone. You shouldn't stoop to their level when arguing with them, lest you become like them. Verse 10 tells us that hiring a drunken fool is like an archer wounding everyone who passes by. Verses 13 to 16 warn against laziness with such aphorisms as, the door turns on its hinges, and sluggards on their beds. They also invent excuses to avoid work, like pretending there are lions in the streets. I'm sure that in reality their excuses were more believable, like imagining imminent rain or the extreme danger of folding a fitted sheet. The final section of chapter 26 covers verses 17 to 28 and warns against gossip and dishonesty. Whoever meddles in the quarrel of another is one who grabs a passing dog by the ears. And without wood, the fire dies out. Without a talebearer, strife subsides. And the lying tongue is its owner's enemy, and the flattering mouth works ruin. Chapter 27 begins with a short section to foster a humble attitude and good personal relationships. Let another praise you, not your own mouth, a stranger, not your own lips. And anger is cruel and wrath overwhelming, but before jealousy, who can stand? Verse 6 would prove true in the Gospels when Judas betrayed Jesus. Trustworthy are the blows of a friend, dangerous the kisses of an enemy. So basically, a friend might not tell you what you want to hear, but it's far better than someone feigning kindness who then stabs you in the back. Constructive criticism isn't always easy to accept, but it's how we grow. Verse 14 reads, "Those who greet their neighbor with a loud voice in the early morning is a curse that can be laid to their charge." This reminds me of an old coworker who would arrive bright and early to the office full of excitement and cheer, and she had the audacity to be happy before I'd even finish my coffee, which I'm pretty sure is a crime. The theme of a troublesome wife appears in verse 15. This time she's compared to a leaky roof on a rainy day. Though telling your spouse that while she's holding knitting needles might cause you to spring a leak. The final verses of chapter 27 offer advice for farmers. It instructs one to be attentive to their flocks and herds, living off the wealth earned from goat's milk and lamb's wool, which will provide for the farmer in old age. Much of chapter 28 is a return to the style seen in earlier sections, where the good and the wicked are contrasted. The wicked flee though none pursue, but the just, like a lion, are confident. The evil understand nothing of justice, but those who see Yahweh understand everything. Whoever walks blamelessly is safe, but one whose ways are crooked falls into a pit. It also compares the wicked to disasters, as we see in verse 3. One who is poor and extorts from the lowly is a devastating rain that leaves no food. Or in verse 15, they're compared to vicious animals. A roaring lion or a ravenous bear is a wicked ruler over a poor people. And in verse 24, frauds are compared to robbers. Whoever defrauds their mother or father and says it is no sin is a partner to a brigand. Before moving on from chapter 28, we need to examine a couple of verses more thoroughly. Verse 4 reads, "Those who abandon instruction praise the wicked, but those who keep instruction oppose them." This is reiterated in verse 7 with, "Whoever heeds instruction is a wise son, but whoever keeps companions with wastrels disgraces his father." In most places in Proverbs, the instruction is said to come from a teacher or a parent, but there's no such connection mentioned in this chapter. And the word used, Torah, can mean instruction, teaching, or law, including the law of Moses. So while this may be a variant proverb that simply fails to mention the teacher, it could also be a reference to obedience to the law, making this more of a legal matter than one of wisdom. In either case, disobedience reflects poorly on the parents. The idea that this is more of a legal-themed chapter is reinforced with verse 17, when we're told that murderers shouldn't be accepted in a just society. In verse 11, we read, "The rich are wise in their own eyes, but the poor who are intelligent see through them." The folly of relying on one's own wisdom is a recurring theme in Proverbs, and here the lesson is combined with the notion that intelligence is more valuable than gold, as the rich man is seen as foolish, but the poor man is intelligent. The final chapter in the Proverbs collected by Hezekiah contrasts the lifestyles of the righteous and the wicked. When the just flourish, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. Verse 3 is a modification of the proverb that encourages one to be wise so their actions will reflect on their father, though this one takes a new turn. Whoever loves wisdom gives joy to his father, but whoever consorts with harlots squanders his wealth. Though, to me, that sounds like a pretty good way to spend money, and it's far more fun than paying bills. The wicked trap themselves with their own sin, while the just run along joyfully. Scoffers cause strife in the city, while the wise can calm the situation. Fools rant and rave, shouting about their anger, while the wise keep a firm handle on their emotions. Haughtiness brings humiliation, but the humble of spirit acquire honor. Finally, an evildoer is an abomination to the just, and one whose way is straight is an abomination to the wicked. The 6th and 7th sections of Proverbs claim northern Arabia as their source of origin. The 6th section, entitled The Sayings of Agur, makes up chapter 30. Agur is said to be a Masaite, which, according to Genesis 25:14, are descendants of Ishmael, the first son of Abraham. So Masa could be a reference to a clan of Semitic nomads or the name of a settlement. The first 14 verses are called the pronouncement of the moral man. In the opening verses, we read, "I am weary, O God, and I'm exhausted. I'm more brute than human being, without even human intelligence. Neither have I learned wisdom, nor have I the knowledge of the Holy One." This establishes the idea that none can know anything of the Creator, and the Creator's knowledge includes that of the entire creation. Humans are devoid of true wisdom. Verse 4 rhetorically asks, "Who has gone up to heaven and come down again? Who has bound up the waters in a cloak? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is that person's name, or the name of his son?" So the one who possesses wisdom is God, the being that arranged the world during its creation and has traveled to heaven. In the next verses, we're told that God is a shield for those who seek refuge in Him, and nothing should be added to His words. This hints at a written scripture which mustn't be corrupted, as we read in Deuteronomy 12:32. The final verses of the first half of chapter 30 outline 4 types of objectionable conduct. These corrupt people curse their parents, according to verse 11. They're self-righteous, or as verse 12 puts it, pure in their own eyes, yet not cleansed of their filth. They're proud, according to verse 13, and aggressively greedy, according to verse 14, devouring the needy and the poor. Proverbs 30:15-33 is a section known as the Numeric sayings. As we saw in chapter 6 in the previous episode, these are sayings that outline a number of examples using the literary formula n plus 1, meaning the text gives a statement that there are a number of things to consider, then reiterates that statement but adds one more item to the count. Such as, there are 6 things Yahweh hates, yes, 7 he considers an abomination. The first list concerns insatiability. 3 things never get their fill, 4 never say enough. Sheol, a barren woman, land that never gets its fill of water, and fire. The next list begins in verse 18 and mentions 4 things that the author finds inexplicable. 3 things are too wonderful for me, yes, 4 I cannot understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a woman. We're meant to understand the first 2 as his inability to comprehend the flight of animals and the locomotion of snakes, which is understandable as flight is pretty extraordinary and running around without any legs is wicked cool. It should also be pointed out that these forms of travel, along with the ship on the sea, leave no discernible trace. The fourth, the way of a man with a woman, might be the mystery of sexual attraction, or the way people behave strangely when around someone they fancy. Though this might also be a warning against fraternizing with another man's wife, especially when read in light of verse 20, which reads, "This is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats, wipes her mouth, and says, 'I have done nothing wrong.'" In this example, eating, of course, means sleeping with a man other than her husband, and wiping her mouth means destroying any evidence of her crime. So, like the eagle in the sky, the snake on the rock, or the ship on the sea, When their deed is complete, there is no evidence of their actions. The next list, in verses 21 to 23, speaks of four classes of people who violate the natural order, like the wicked man who prospers or the just man who suffers. Under three things the earth trembles, under four it cannot bear up. It then lists a slave who becomes king, a fool who is glutted with food, an unloved woman who is wed, and a maidservant who displaces her mistress. Verses 24 to 28 speak of examples of wisdom found in nature. Four things are among the smallest on earth, and yet are exceedingly wise. Ants, a species not strong, yet they store up their food in summer. Badgers, a species not mighty, yet they make their home in the crags. Locusts, they have no king, yet they march forth in formation. Lizards, you can catch them with your hands, yet they find their way into kings' palaces. There's no argument for me concerning the behavior of lizards, but if he thinks badgers aren't mighty, he apparently hasn't seen that one YouTube video about the honey badger. The final list simply covers creatures that demonstrate pride through their gait. Three things are stately in their stride, yes, four are stately in their carriage. The lion, mightiest of beasts, retreats before nothing. The strutting cock, and the he-goat, and the king at the head of his people. The seventh section of Proverbs, the words of Lemuel, king of Massa, fills the first 9 verses of chapter 31. As mentioned in the previous episode, Massa is likely a reference to a settlement in northern Arabia. We're told in the opening line of the chapter that what follows are the instructions told to Lemuel by his mother, continuing the theme of wisdom passed down through the generations from parent to child. What follows in verses 2 through 9 is a poem which affirms the royal duties and was possibly composed for and used during some royal functions, such as the enthronement of a prince or a king. The poem deals with 3 subjects. First, it advises maintaining authority over the women of the royal court and warns against giving one's strength to those who might bring ruin. Next comes a warning against drunkenness. Overindulgence in wine can cause one to forget their decrees and violate the rights of citizens who need assistance. Lastly, one should show compassion toward the poor and needy, helping them to forget their misery and standing up for those who are disadvantaged. The 8th and final section of Proverbs, the Poem of the Good Wife, or Poem of the Woman of Worth, concludes chapter 31 with verses 10 to 31. The purpose of the poem is to outline the value of finding a suitable wife and the benefits such a woman can bring to her husband as she raises children and maintains the household. Her position is like a chief servant, guiding those beneath her for the benefits of her master. As such, she is more valuable than jewels. She's an investment that pays off year after year, bringing a net profit to the husband all the days of her life. She seeks new opportunities to benefit her husband and secures appropriate provisions for him and the household. Rising before the dawn to attend to her duties in the kitchen and inspecting suitable farmland for acquisition. She sees to the servants, ensuring they're properly clothed and fed, and works to see her husband elevated in society. She's tireless in her efforts and never idle. This, in the minds of the authors, is a woman's worth. Her value lies not in what she is or what she can accomplish, but rather how her efforts can financially and socially benefit her husband and his household. Her personal qualities are of no importance. An ideal woman, according to Proverbs 31:10-31, is nothing more than an overachieving domestic servant, whose purpose is to bring financial gain to the man to whom she's married, and how her efforts reflect on him in the eyes of his peers. This not only diminishes her other accomplishments, and indeed herself as a person, but also detracts from any woman who doesn't measure up to this ridiculous standard. Proverbs as a whole is a composition of great complexity and contradiction. Compiled over centuries, edited and redacted, added to and rearranged, it contains timeless wisdom and outdated advice. It encourages kindness to the poor and needy, and violence toward children. respect toward one's mother, and contempt for one's own wife. It tells us that wisdom originates from the solitary deity in the universe, but also from a female co-creator who existed before the world was born. Rather than viewing this work as a book of Proverbs, which should be taken to heart, it should be seen as a collection of sayings and poems that give us a glimpse into the minds and hearts of the men who collected and wrote them. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.